Good afternoon, Tzarayim Tovim. I would like to begin by wishing everybody a happy first day of Hanukkah. Something happens this year that, in terms of my multi-faith work and just being a human being, part of the B'nai Adam as well as B'nai Yisrael, I love that Christmas and Hanukkah, New Year's, are exactly at the same time, the same dates. I think it's so interesting because it gives us an opportunity to share and celebrate what we share and observe and distinguish and respect where we differ. I think timing is so interesting in that we work with a luni-solar calendar in the Jewish world, whereas the secular world, or the general world as we know it, works with a solar calendar. And working with different calendars is interesting because, for example, many of us will remember the big brouhaha when China agreed to work with the general calendar of the world and not just their calendar. Calendars and timing can isolate. They can also bring together. Remember, Antiochus, in terms of the story of Hanukkah, forbade any practices that distinguished the Jews as Jews, not doing Brit Milah, not observing Kashrut, and not observing Shabbat or any kind of time-keeping element that would distinguish this community as an entity. So when we see this interfacing of the two calendars, I just think it's a moment for us to stop and reflect and think about, yes, what we share and where we differ, and remember to ask questions and to try to learn and bring a humility to that discussion that you may engage in, not the notion that my way is the only way. So this Devar Torah is entitled Getting Ourselves Right with Each Other and the Land. It is actually pretty much reframed from one I gave in 2015, almost 9 years ago. As we live in a climate, pun intended, of fractured discourse and being bullied by those who yell the loudest, we must, as people of reason, continue to acknowledge the presence of God, to hear the words and teachings of God, and to bring God's presence into our present through our own involvements and initiatives. For this Parsha discussion, we are going to look at Yoseph as listening to God and using that connection to be attuned to the land and save the world of his time. A good number of years ago, I had the honor of writing curriculum and providing resources for Kanfei Nisharim, an organization whose mission is the addressing of the challenge of getting environmental sustainability on the agenda of the Orthodox community, who often feels, too often, I would say, that it's not a problem, or at least it's not our problem. This feeling is too pervasive in our observant community, where we generally find this siloed approach too often, and as well, certainly in our political reality, where we don't think that if it doesn't directly impact us, as we see it at this moment in time, then it's not our problem. However, when one uses one's own sense of reason, it is clear that dismissing this challenge will not make it go away. It is very much present in our lives. When I shared these thoughts originally in 2015, it happened that Shabbat of Hanukkah and Rosh Chodesh happened simultaneously. It was the seventh day of Hanukkah, Rosh Chodesh, and Shabbat. And there's this interesting little piece of Jewish practice trivia. Whoever is celebrating or observing a Brit Milah on such a day gets to say the longest possible Birkat Hamazon, the very blessing we say after we have eaten, that reminds us of God's creative power, our stewardship of the land, the importance of our relationships with each other, and with the land that sustains and supports us. And, of course, it's a Brit Milah. as was not allowed by Antiochus. This time around, having just begun the Festival of Lights, Chag Urim, Shabbat will fall on the third day. And that's opportunity of 2015, which repeated in 2022, will not be here. But hold that thought, because if you have a good memory, next year, 2025, 5786 in the Jewish count, this is exactly what will happen. In the meantime, Hanukkah represents the dream of religious freedom and meaningful survival for our people. How appropriate that Yoseph's story as viceroy in Egypt, about which we read this week, is our Torah portion. It is significant to note that Joseph's interpretation of Pharaoh's dreams are preferable to Pharaoh over those of his own wise advisors from within his own culture, leading not just to freedom for his own people, but also saving all through intelligent and mindful thinking about resources. What transformation had Yoseph undergone, enabling him to interpret Pharaoh's dreams in such a convincing fashion? Notice when we saw his dreams in the beginning, they went from universal, the sheaves of wheat, the sun and the moon and the stars, to personal. You will all bow down to me. You will all acquiesce to me. Whereas here, it's going the other way. Pharaoh has these dreams, and they are being interpreted in their largesse, vis-a-vis how to save the community from famine. In chapter 41, verse 14, Pharaoh sends for Yoseph. He's hurried out of the dungeon. He has his hair cut. He changes from his clothes, and then he appears from Pharaoh, in front of Pharaoh in a respectful way. Pharaoh says to Yoseph, Chalom chalamti ufatar ein oto va'ani shamati alecha lemor tishma chalom liftor oto. I've had this dream. No one can interpret it, but I was told that you can. When we look at the words, tishma chalom liftor oto, you can listen to the dream to interpret it. Rashi says, you listen carefully and you understand to interpret its real meaning, showing this growth that Yoseph had gone through. Tishma itself, the word, not the same as ha'azinu, give ear, leads to this notion of understanding, listening carefully. Shma, coming from your insides, being there's a difference between hearing and truly listening. And that's what we're evoking here. Joseph then answers Pharaoh and says, I want you to understand something. V'yan Yosef el Paro lemor, bil adi Elohim ya'aneh et shalom Paro. It's not through me. It's God that is going to answer this dream. It is God that will provide an answer that we will be able to understand what it was that you have dreamt. Notice, it is clearly God's presence that Yosef is bringing to bear. And in so doing, will offer interpretations of the dreams referencing how to use the resources, in this first dream about animals and the second one about crops. As a result of this, Yosef will be promoted to the second in command position in Egypt's hierarchy. With him, the presence and protective hand of God will be present. Yosef says to Pharaoh, chapter 41, verse 25, the two parts are actually repetition of one and the same dream. Elohim oseh hikid leparo. That which God is doing, God is about to tell. Here we are observing the unfolding of an economic plan regarding responsible use of resources in a part of the world and time known for widespread famines. Pharaoh has had the dream twice, and why? In verse 32, it says, why? Pamayim, twice. Ki nachon hadavar me'im halokim u'memaher halokim lasato. Because God is very clear about what's going on, and God is moving quickly to carry it out. God's hand is all in here. And we're going to see this amplify later as we go into Shemot, where God does tell what is going on. The question is, are we listening? So now let Pharaoh seek out a man of discernment and wisdom and put him in charge of Egypt. Let Pharaoh take steps to appoint officials to help the distribution of food during the 7 years of plenty. And during those years, let them gather the food to store it so that it will be there for the years of drought. Similarly, we think about resources and how we use them, as well as God's hand in helping us plan in our celebration of Hanukkah. In our Gemara, we read in Shabbat 21b, when the Seleucid Greeks entered the Holy Temple, they impurified all of the oils that were in the temple. And when the kingdom of the house of Hashmonai had grown stronger and conquered them, they checked and found only one jar of oil upon which had been placed the seal of the high priest. And there was only enough in it to light one day with it. A miracle occurred, and they were able to light it for 8 days. So we always talk about this miracle, and again, is a nay something that we can't understand? Or if we can explain it, does that mean that God's hand is anything less in it? So I want to propose something different, because we had a different experience last night. When we were in Israel, not this last time, the time before, about a year ago, we bought a menorah that is an oil menorah. So for the first time this year, Ken and I lit an oil menorah. Now, if you've ever seen the cups of oil that go on the oil menorah, they're very teeny tiny. But they last 2.5 hours. So amounts sometimes can be misleading in terms of what we see, and not to take away from the miracle of it all, but maybe the magic of it, that given the way the wind blows or what bears on the resource, whatever, yes, it could last that amount of time, and we could explain it, but that doesn't make it any less wonderful. The famous and well-known miracle of this one tiny jug of oil that did not seem like so much, lasting 8 times its expected yield, is certainly quite something to consider. The idea that the utilization of a fuel resource for 8 times its expected output would be considered miraculous today as well. Would it be that our gasoline and other fuel supplies would yield such abundance? Yet, we also know that if we use them in a smart and intelligent way, they certainly can last longer than would be expected. Even 5-fold or 3-fold would be tremendously helpful to our ability to utilize the limited and in these times expensive resources of fuel. Maybe, just maybe, we need a Yoseph, or we need an understanding of our land and of God's presence to use our resources, conserve our resources, and make them last longer, not assuming that they are so quickly and easily dispensable. Parshat Miketz is subtitled by Rav Shaul David Yudaman, The Song of the Land, a Torah teaching for the Western environmentalist. I want to give Rabbi Yudaman hakarat hatov for much of the thinking that goes into this exploration that follows. He reminds us that we know that the environmental movement that has sprung forth in our contemporary world bears many imprints of the same paradigms of thought that have led to the environmental crisis itself, some of which we can find rooted in the text that we just read. There's a tendency to rush towards results and overlook the process to organically arrive at those results. And part of our work in healing is to redress these internalized ways of thinking to arrive at a truly sustainable way of living. Throughout our Torah, this lesson of our need to be mindful of the process of our use of resources is continually emphasized. And this was, in fact, a theme of my Parsha discussions some years ago, where we did go Parsha by Parsha by Parsha. In his searing novel, Cloud Atlas, David Mitchell shows the horrible and most destructive ending of the lack of such mindfulness, when our desire for more and more will simply result in our own destruction and devastation from less and less. More space, more land, more use of resources, more accumulated material things has reached its limit, many would claim, in terms of the threat to our planet for any sense of continued well-being. At the beginning of our Parsha, we hear of Pharaoh's prophetic dream, 7 robust cows devoured by 7 frail ones. The symbolism here may seem clear for all to see, our own attempt to rush to create the best and the biggest and the most will quickly devour it all. Think of the fears today that accompany AI, where technology has taken over our lives in so many ways, where we and our children have lost skills because of dependence on these things that we didn't have when we were going through our formative years. It is a vision that perhaps foretells of our human endeavors with technology, a golden age of enlightenment and invention, industrialization, and higher qualities of life, now quivering under the unknown threat of today's environmental crisis. We are once again confronted with the question, just because we can do X, doesn't mean we should. Why weren't the Egyptians and their wise men, wise teachers, able to understand the dream? Upon hearing Joseph's interpretation, it seems fairly clear. Was it myopia? Was it denial? How do we, as environmentally conscious and caring people, aware of the dreams, the predictions of our scientists today, share the interpretation? How do we address the global warming deniers, the ones who would not listen to how we need to appropriately use our medical resources to contain diseases or use technologies to make the land work its best, if not its fastest? The challenge of giving over the bad news is something that our environmentalists have now been struggling with for decades. With news that nobody wants to hear, how do we spread the message? Those that have more than they need keep using it, and those that don't have what they need don't have accessibility to it because the ones without the need are not participating in equitable distribution of resources. Our goal is to not share bad news, but rather to inspire, to motivate, to guide necessary changes that society and individuals need to make. How do we achieve this? We hear much talk about intentional living in our society today on all levels, our acceptance of each other, in conflict resolution, in reclaiming our ability to have civil conversations and not scream and yell and shout each other down, and in terms of the very basic parameters of our relationships with each other and with the planet that whether or not we acknowledge, we all share. In this Parsha, we see so much of this. Both sage advice from Yoseph to Pharaoh in how to avert an environmental disaster, and in terms of the resolution we see unfolding between Yoseph and his brothers. In a broader perspective, those actions are the result of a deeper problem, an imbalance of spirit, relationships, and ultimately exile from both our land and from ourselves. If our lifestyle is out of balance with the ecosystems we inhabit and the people around us, isn't it obvious that our inner dimensions of how we live are also out of balance? This is what Yoseph brought in his interpretation of the dreams. He was able to look in from the outside, to be sort of the participant observer, and to say, this is what we need to do. I know how to deal with famine. I know my family's a group of shepherds, not to use up all our resources at once, to protect, to think over the long range. This is what he brings to a culture where everything was based on what we have at this moment in time, regardless of what others may or may not have. While we are seeing great advances in potential in addressing the action side of our crisis, is enough attention being paid to the inner dimensions of disconnect and lack of concern for other people? Is this why our political lives are so polarized at this time? Is this why families can't even have conversations if they believe differently about so many different things? Think about, for example, when Yoseph is concerned with all of Egypt in the solutions he proposes for Pharaoh. How many of us are attuned to the absolutely lopsided and harmful fact that 10% of our planet's population utilizes more than 90% of its resources, while less than 10% is still available for 90% of those that inhabit our planet? Do we care? Do we understand that it is clearly a Jewish responsibility to do so while bringing God's presence and vision into our world? As green technologies become a greater part of public awareness and economic reality, the actions seem more viable to fix. But our personal investment and awareness of what we need to do remains as disconnected as ever. How do we address this experiential exile from our place, the earth that God created and the people that inhabit it? How do we share that the importance of a personal connection to one's habitat, to its seasons, the fruits, the land, the living experience of connection to a place, the needs of all of those around us, is really a connection to a part of our own larger self and the community of which we are a part? Yoseph, the favorite son of Yaakov, who years before was left for dead by his jealous brothers, has come to power and in Egypt. Is in charge of dispensing the only food stores in the entire region, which are there due to his understanding of the larger picture in the beginning. Within this awareness, there is still a disconnect for Yoseph from his family of origin. In this setting, Yaakov, his father, sends a care package down with his brothers to the rulers, who has confronted his own brothers but not revealed himself, gifting him with fruits of the land of Israel. Rabbi Nachman writes that Yaakov was sending this mysterious ruler of Egypt a taste of what the land of Israel is. This is perhaps the true core of environmental work, to pass on the awareness of ourselves within our surroundings. When Yaakov sends Yosef the package, the Torah calls it Zimrat Haaretz, the song of the land. The translation of Onkelos takes this phrase as the crops that a land is praised for is its song. The connection between fruits and song is a rather significant theme in Jewish agriculture. As the Mishna'ot of Bikurim, the first fruits, describes, the bringing of the first fruits to Yerushalayim in the days of the temple was accompanied by music. In Brachot 35a, we're taught, song is not said except for over wine. Here it is not words, but rather the taste and the smell of the fruits of the land that have the power to bring us back to a place of pure connection. This is a true connection to environment, and it is this connection to the tastes and smells of his past. Within that context, Yosef will now reveal himself to his family. He is now reconciled with the land, the environment of his origin, and he will now do so with the people of his past as well. We learn in Midrash Kohelet Rabbah 7:13, God says, "See my works, how fine and excellent they are. All that I created for you. Reflect on this and do not corrupt or desolate my world, For if you do, there will be no one to repair it after you. This theme can be heard in current environmentalist requests to remember that we have to preserve the world, that there are generations that will come after us. If we use everything up and destroy it, then we do not leave a legacy. To what degree did Yoseph understand this? How imperative is it that we do so as well? What are we wasting and not using in terms of counting and acknowledging our blessings and the responsibility that they carry regarding our relationship to the land and our relationship to each other in working with and for that land? In my daily learning, I'm often reminded that for those who have more resources, along with those resources comes a responsibility to share them with others. That's what gathering the leket, the fruits that drop or in the corners or too high or too low or whatever, and having people come to gather them, the Ruth story. That's what that reminds us of. We are not just to sit and use up everything that we have. We are to share. We're told that when we light the Hanukkah candles, Rak lirot tam bildad, we're only to look at them. We're not to use them to read by or what have you, like we might with other candles. But when we look at them, we are to think about the miracles and about, and again, not miracles as poof, magic, but those actions that bring together God, us, timing, the land. How do we reflect on all of that while the candles are lit? Now, interestingly, we did that when we used regular candles. This year, with these little vials of oil that one would not expect to, but they last for 2.5 hours, we did not sit there for 2.5 hours and look at the candles. I must be absolutely transparent about that. But you do appreciate, it brought a new appreciation of the idea of the kad shemen. So when you lose, I got the idea of the kad shemen, the little vial of oil, but we didn't sit for 2.5 hours and meditate on the candles. We learn in Sefer Achinuch 52, righteous people do not waste in this world even a mustard seed. They become sorrowful with every wasteful and destructive act that they see. And if they can, they use all their strength to save everything possible from destruction. But the wicked rejoice in their excessive use of resources and in the destruction of the world. And they do so as they destroy themselves. As we think about our lives today, to what degree are we endangering lives by not protecting our land, our atmosphere? And how are we exacerbating the disconnect in our relationships with each other? Here is Mitchell's lesson from Cloud Atlas. If we do not value each other and the planet we share more, we are all doomed. That was never the plan of Ribono Shel Olam as set out in our narrative, our Torah. As we light the candles of Chag Urim Sameach, Chag Harim this week, let us consider this. We must take the initiative to save ourselves, save our community, save our planet, and save each other. This is the evolution of the prophetic message. This is the addition to claim his Yerusha that Yoseph puts on the plate for us as we have been discussing that trajectory for this year's Parsha discussions. Yosef, son of Yaakov, leaves us this lesson. Reconcile with the land, learn how to use it. Reconcile with each other, learn how to appreciate and love and care. Shabbat Shalom, Chag Urim Sameach, Lehitraat.